This week on Melt, why aren't creative agencies making enough money? The business of creativity, explained by talented Gautam Raghunath.
The way that agencies have been pricing ourselves historically is warped. We're still pricing for employee hours, not on the value that we generate. And that's where the entire problem starts. Suresh, I think the simplest thing to do is first stop charging for input and start charging for value.
Good morning, Asia, and good evening, America. Welcome to the weekend edition of Wild DNA. I'm Eric Njoka. On the show at this hour, we'll tell you the latest on the Gaza war and the United Nations resolution that could change the cause of the time and the war. Plus, what's happening in business, sports, and entertainment. Let's begin with the headlines. U.S. State Department reports says Israel's use of U.S.-provided weapons in Gaza likely violated international humanitarian law, but it does not formally find evidence that it had done so. Keeps options open for supply of further U.S. weapons to Israel. United Nations General Assembly passes resolution supporting full membership for Palestine, pressing the United Nations Security Council to give a favorable consideration to the bid. India among 143 nations that voted in favor of the resolution. Fighting intensifies on two fronts for Israel. 4 IDF soldiers killed as battles rage on across Gaza. Rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. Lebanon's Iran-backed Hezbollah group says it fired Katyusha rockets at Israel on Friday in retaliation for the strikes. Ukraine says it has repelled a strong Russian armored attack in the northeastern Kharkiv region, saying, quote, not a single meter of land lost. US announces new weapons package for Ukraine. Beijing lashes out at what it calls Washington's mistakes after US added 37 more Chinese entities to its trade blacklist, citing national security concerns. At least 50 people killed, many missing in flash floods in Afghanistan's northern Baghlan province. Reports of massive losses to homes and property in several districts. Days after US President Joe Biden said in an interview that American bombs had been used to kill civilians in Gaza, now a US State Department report says that Israel may have breached humanitarian law in its war in Gaza. In a much-awaited report ordered by the White House and submitted to Congress, the State Department says Israel likely violated norms on international law in its use of US weapons. And so, it is reasonable to assess that US defense articles have been used by Israeli security forces since October 7th, in instances inconsistent with its international humanitarian law obligations. The report also said that while the US or the Israel Defense Forces have the knowledge, experience and tools to minimize harm, the results on the ground, including high levels of civilian casualties, raise substantial questions as to whether the IDF is using them effectively in all cases. While the US report essentially raises questions on some of the Israeli operations in Gaza, it refrains from stating it definitely that the Israel Defense Forces had breached international law. It also says that since Israel's assurance on adhering to the legal use of US weapons were credible and reliable, the weapons shipments could continue. The report comes 2 days after Joe Biden warned Israel to withhold bombs and artillery shells if Israel goes ahead with an assault on Rafah. The White House has confirmed that President Joe Biden is fully briefed on the findings of the report. Meanwhile, Washington also said, so far, no major Israeli operation has been seen against the packed Gaza city of Rafah, and the U.S. government is watching it with concern. On the ground, however, Israel has seized the Rafah crossing into Egypt from Hamas militants. The closure of the border has raised new concerns about aid delivery into Gaza, where the United Nations has warned of famine risks. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis is a military expert and the host of Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. He's now joining us live from Virginia. Colonel Davis, welcome to the program and thank you very much for making time for us. It's good to see you. How damning is this report?
Well, it's kind of basically designed to try and thread the needle to try to make everybody happy. And I think as a result, it's making nobody happy, because it does say things that are very clear that says there is credible evidence that some of the American weapons have been used to kill civilians in the Gaza Strip. And then in the same report says, but there's not enough evidence for us to conclusive, so we're going to keep giving the weapons. So it's like President Biden goes on CNN last night and, makes this big statement about how he's going to withhold weapons if they use them to kill civilians in the Gaza Strip. Then you have the Israeli parliament today, or their war cabinet, say that they have decided they are going to go in there to do that. So it's kind of just a big mess about what does the United States actually mean when they say these things, and will they ever stop weapons shipments to Israel?
Colonel Davis, we heard from the Israeli war cabinet that the assault on Rafah will be limited. But what we are seeing on the ground is a little bit different. Who's saying what when it comes to the offensive in Rafah? And if Israel decides to go ahead with the offensive, what are the ramifications of that?
Well, everything is in the eye of the beholder, and Israel has throughout this war said one thing and kind of done something different. And very often they say, this thing is happening right here when it's not, or this is not happening and it is, and it's self-evident. So really all you can go by is what's actually happening on the ground. And we know they approved the operation today. We know that there has been airstrikes every day into the Rafah area, even before any of these people are trying to get out. And when they go in there on the ground, I mean, I think it's like parsing, trying to be nitpicky to say it's a heavy one or it's a medium one. If you're going in there and you're trying to kill people and you're blowing stuff up, that's a ground incursion, however you want to parse it. And then now that it gets back to, does President Biden mean what he says when he says he's going to withhold artillery and rocket ammunition if Israel goes in there? And so now it appears that they are. And I think it's up to him to decide if he's going to be a man of his word or not.
Still talking about America, what's the position right now going forward with this war in Gaza? Where do you see America's role playing significantly in averting civilian casualties and this war turning out to be, a war crime?
Well, look, as I've been saying on your program many times before, the path that Israel is on right now, that Netanyahu has committed his country to militarily, cannot be achieved. They cannot bring peace to their people by the military means they're employing here because so many people are being killed. And look, again, you can take the words away and just look at what's happened on the ground. There is so much evidence that this is just wanton, absolute destruction of the ability for the Palestinian people to survive, whether they have homes or not, or whether there's people there or not. And I mean, you have the IJC said there's credible evidence that there is a genocide going on. So the question for the U.S., are you going to facilitate that? Or are you going to act on what your eyes see and say, we're not going to participate in this? Because helping Israel now, giving them the weapons that they're asking for, perversely will not bring peace to them. So withholding those weapons, it's going to be a big problem. It's going to cause a rift between the two sides. There's no question. But without those weapons and without those ammunition, Israel can't continue on at the same pace that it's been going, and therefore people won't be killed at the same pace. And I keep getting back to it. It just depends on what the United States is going to do with its credibility and its word.
Finally, Colonel Davis, we saw the United Nations General Assembly vote in support of a Palestinian bid for full membership. Your thoughts?
Well, look, I mean, the United States with its words says that we believe in a two-state solution, and now here presented with a golden opportunity to put action to those words, we punted again and said no. We were one of 9 states out of the entire globe that said no. And look, I just worry for our country because we're just getting on the wrong side of history. We're getting on the wrong side of our own values. And the rest of the world is continuing to move in a direction of that there needs to be a peace in this. There needs to be a solution for these people. And right now, Israel doesn't want to give the Palestinians any hope for self-governance, much less a state of their own. And, we're just not on the right side of this. I'm afraid I can't put it any better than that.
All right. I've been talking to retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis, who is a military expert and the host of Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. Colonel Davis, thank you.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.
4 Israeli soldiers have been killed and several wounded as fierce battles rage on across the Gaza Strip. The Israeli army says the soldiers were killed when an explosive device went off near a school in Gaza City. An officer and another soldier from the same battalion were seriously wounded in the explosion. IDF says it is still unclear whether the incident occurred in a booby-trapped house or as the soldiers were passing through a city street. The fight back from Hamas comes as Israeli troops are pushing farther into Rafah in southern Gaza as its tanks split the city in two and encircle the eastern half. On the other hand, Hamas militants have fired a salvo of rockets at the southern city of Beersheba for the first time since December, likely injuring a woman. Hamas's armed wing, claiming the attack, says it targeted the city with a missile barrage in response to massacres against civilians in Gaza. While according to Israel, 5 rockets were launched towards the city in total. 1 was intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, and most fell in open areas. While in Jerusalem, the United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees is closing its Jerusalem compound after Israeli protesters twice set fire to its perimeter.
Last night there was a fire in our compound. Some locals started that fire. We have them on CCTV. They started that fire, which expanded about 70 meters of dry brush. We then had a second fire 2 hours later, very near our petrol station in the back of the compound, petrol and diesel. And of course, this would have been very dangerous if that had exploded. The whole community, because we have many residents here, many neighbors, it would have been extremely dangerous.
According to the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the staff had to put the fires out themselves because firefighters and police were slow to arrive at the headquarters. No one was injured in the arson attack. While in central Gaza's Nuseirat camp, rescue workers and civilians searched frantically for victims after a strike reduced a home to rubble and caused severe damage. And in southern Gaza's Rafah, Palestinians fear a famine worse than in the north amid the ongoing Israeli assault on the city. And after the army seized the Rafah crossing into Egypt from Hamas militants, the closure of the border has raised new concerns about aid delivery into Gaza, where the United Nations has warned of famine.
The situation in Rafah is on a knife's edge as airstrikes continue throughout southern Gaza. Over 1 million Palestinians, half of whom are children, have crowded in the Rafah governorate for shelter. We are actively engaged with all involved for the resumption of the entry of life-saving supplies, including desperately needed fuel, through Rafah and Kerem Shalom crossings.
On the diplomacy front, Hamas officials said efforts to forge a hostage release and truce in the 7-month war has come back to square one after Israel effectively rejected a proposal by the international mediator. The U.S., which is a longtime ally of Israel, believes remaining gaps can be surmounted as in-person talks on a Gaza ceasefire for hostages agreement concluded for now with no deal.
The entire world was rightfully outraged. But this outrage.
The United Nations General Assembly voted in support of a Palestinian bid for full membership of the organization on Friday. The Palestinian Authority welcomed the resolution, saying the mandate shows Palestine deserves full United Nations membership. The resolution states that Palestinians should be admitted to the United Nations. It also grants additional rights as observers. 143 nations voted in favor, while 9 countries voted against it and 25 abstained. The United Nations General Assembly vote is being called a symbolic move in the backdrop of the United States veto in the Security Council on Palestinian call for membership. Palestinian membership came back in focus at a time when Israel's military operations in Gaza are making headlines and has alarmed global leaders and humanitarian organizations alike. While the Palestinians currently are a non-member observer state, the request for membership goes back to 2011. Meanwhile, the Israeli delegation at the United Nations had a dramatic response to the overwhelming support for Palestinian membership. Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Gilad Erdan, took a shredding machine at the podium, where he proceeded to shred several pages of the United Nations Charter as he addressed the assembly.
This is your mirror, so that you can see exactly what you are inflicting upon the UN Charter with this destructive vote. This is you are shredding the UN Charter with your own hands. Yes, that's what you're doing, shredding the UN Charter. Shame on you.
For the Palestinian bid for full United Nations membership to succeed, the United Nations Security Council has to unanimously vote in favor of the bid, following which it needs a 2/3 majority vote in the General Assembly. However, Israel's strongest ally, the U.S., vetoed the bid at the United Nations Security Council on April 18th. While U.S. President Joe Biden has on several occasions emphasized a two-state solution, Washington opposes any recognition of Palestinian statehood outside of a bilateral accord between the Palestinians and Israelis. And for more on this, our correspondent Susan Teherani has sent us this report from New York.
The United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly voted to upgrade Palestine's status as a non-member observer state, granting it increased international recognition and influence. The move was criticized by Israel, which views it as a reward for terrorism and a hindrance to peace negotiations. Israel's ambassador to the United Nations said today the General Assembly is not only granting the rights of a state to the Palestinian Terror Authority, today you are also granting privileges to the future terror state of Hamas. You have opened up the United Nations to modern-day Nazis. The vote is seen as a symbolic international endorsement of Palestinian statehood, with many Western countries reconsidering their previous stance of linking full recognition to a final Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution. At the end of the day, the General Assembly vote serves as a non-binding survey of global support for a full Palestinian membership, but does not have the power or authority to grant that full membership. Susan Tefrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
In other news on Wild DNA, at least 62 people have been killed in flash floods due to heavy rains in Baghlan province in northern Afghanistan. A spokesperson for Taliban's Ministry of the Interior has said that the toll is expected to rise. 2 heavy storms over a few hours battered more than 5 districts in Baghlan. Emergency personnel and the country's security forces from the National Army and the police have been searching for victims under the mud and rubble. According to the Provincial Director of Natural Disaster Management in Baghlan, the floods have caused heavy loss to human lives, homes and properties. Many families remain trapped in their homes. Rescue teams and helicopters have been dispatched to the heavily flooded area, but the lack of night vision lights rendered the operation unsuccessful. Bodies of the dead shrouded in white and black cloth were laid out in northern Afghanistan. This map shows the location of the province of Baghlan, where 50 people died. The floods have also hit the capital Kabul. Reports indicate that day flooding of the region started overnight after heavy rain. Authorities have dispatched aid to the affected areas, including tents, blankets and food. The Southeast Asian country is highly vulnerable to flash floods, stated to be the impact of climate change. Heavy rains lashed Afghanistan last month as well, triggering flash flooding across several provinces. Some 70 people and 2,500 animals lost their lives. At least 2,000 homes, 3 mosques and 4 schools were destroyed. 95,000 acres of farmland was wiped away. More than 40 million people in Afghanistan depend on agriculture for survival.